Just out there living her best life.
Eating people.
What more could you want?
Really?
Books. Books. Books.
Hello and welcome to Didn't Read It, the podcast that is absolutely certain that those two ladies were just roommates. I am your host, Grace Todd, a lady who is definitely not a voracious sex monster of any kind. And with me today is friend of the pod, Galen Canham.
Also definitely not a voracious sex monster.
No. We are heterosexual, unproblematic ladies with perfectly normal sex drives, which is to say, no sex drive at all.
Yep, definitely never bitten anyone on the neck before.
No, we would never. That would be rude. Today, we are continuing our discussion of Carmilla. For those who may need a refresher, I'm going to attempt to give you an extremely abbreviated rundown of the events of Carmilla, and you can tell me where I have or haven't gone wrong. Does this sound good?
Heard. Sounds good.
Okay, so we have a lady named Laura who lives with her dad in the middle of nowhere. The closest thing to them is a decrepit village where all the people have fled for questionable reasons.
Yes.
They are walking through the woods. A carriage comes flying out of nowhere. A young woman is ejected from it unconscious. Her mother, quote unquote, is like, I have to bolt, but can you just like hold on to my daughter for an indeterminate amount of time?
So far, so good.
They take the lady back to their house. There is an escalating sexual tension that becomes more and more overt as we slowly discover that that lady is, in fact, a vampire.
Dun, dun, dun.
Who is slowly eating Laura.
Yes.
Hot. Eventually, what is he, a general? The general?
The general.
What do you do with the general?
Take him to kill a vampire.
The general, who is a family friend, bursts onto the scene, explains that his daughter was also murdered by the same vampire who has attempted to cleverly conceal her identity with the use of insultingly obvious anagrams.
Yep.
And the vampire is then vanquished.
Yeah, that about sums it up.
More or less the end. Mm-hmm. How'd I do?
Yeah, that was pretty spot on.
All right. Well, with that reminder, Carmilla, let's talk about it.
Yeah, so I guess I should talk very briefly about Joseph Sheridan Le Fanu, who's the author, just for a little bit of context. I'm not going to go super deep into it, but he was an Irish author born early 1800s. I want to say 1814. I was right. Yes, he was born in 1814, moved around somewhat in his childhood. His father was a clergyman.
Oh.
So he grew up in the church. Apparently, one of the things I was reading that is he grew up in, his father was a stern Protestant churchman, as it said, and they grew up almost in the Calvinist tradition. So like the church, like God is in charge, and maybe we're a little angry about it.
Yeah. There's no redeeming yourself. God didn't like you to begin with.
Yeah. So, which is just fascinating to think of when they're discussing, vampires and God. They don't like each other.
Irish. That's really interesting because that puts a bit of a twist on the idea of vampires as the aristocracy.
Yes, because the Irish were not crazy about the aristocracy.
I can't imagine why.
Yeah, I mean, he did a lot of things in life. He actually studied to be a lawyer at one point in time and then gave up on that and moved into journalism and then got into writing fiction. And one of the various things he did throughout his lifetime was work on, it was basically like a campaign, more or less just against the government's response to the Irish famine.
Huh.
Yeah.
That is a whole perspective on the story that I was not expecting.
I know. I read the book before I looked at anything about anyone and read all that. And I was like, it's fascinating.
That makes the quiet background deaths of the peasants a lot more compelling.
Yeah.
Narratively, like the extent to which Carmilla as monster is a product explicitly of the aristocracy.
Yes.
And the fact that Laura and her family, that like Laura's father as the landowner is not compelled to do anything about what is happening until it is his own daughter who is being threatened.
Yeah, and there was that line I mentioned in the previous episode about, well, it's just their imagination. Like they're all just infecting each other with these crazy thoughts.
If they wanted food, they'd imagine that they had it.
Yeah.
God, I know that there was a horrible chapter in the Irish famine where there were essentially, and I'm paraphrasing this, I'm not a historian, don't come at me, but I want to say that there was a point in the Irish famine where there were like ships full of food that were being sent to the country, and they were turned away by the British government.
Yes, that is a thing.
And I want to say that the justification in part was like, well, if they wanted food, they'd work harder for it.
Yeah, there was a lot of unnecessary blame. It's almost like the way people talk about poor people in our country. It's like, you just gotta pull yourself up by the bootstraps. It's like, we don't even have boots.
No, Galen, that's not true. Capitalism is the only solution, and it's working perfectly well.
If there's anything we know, it's that capitalism is awesome.
Capitalism is always the answer.
Yes.
No, that does provide a lot of really interesting texture, as you say, to the idea where he's like, the peasants are just being hysterical. Clearly these women are dying because they just didn't try hard enough to be alive.
And he's like, no, it's just like natural causes, and they're just freaking each other out about all this supernatural bullshit. Like, it's fine. God will fix everything.
Oh my God.
Yeah.
All right.
Yep. So yeah, that's how he was raised. Like I said, he went to law school for a while, but ended up not practicing law, got into journalism, ended up writing fiction. Somewhere along that path, he got married. His wife, honestly, this reminded me, so the last time we met in this here podcasting space, we were talking about Rappaccini's daughter and Nathaniel Hawthorne. And it was just an interesting parallel to me that one of the things we talked about was that Hawthorne's wife was suffering from those migraines and jumping from doctor to doctor. And it was a whole thing. Le Fanu's wife didn't suffer from migraines, but she had, it seems like what might be termed like, I don't know, anxiety and depression these days, but she had like quote unquote neurotic episodes and suffered from hysteria. And again, it seemed like he loved her, you know.
I was going to say, like, what was he sympathetic or?
Yeah, well, and then they were married for a while, they had some children, and then at some point it says she suffered like a hysterical episode and she ends up dying from like unnamed causes. I don't know if it was like directly related to that, again, quote unquote hysterical episode, but she ends up passing away and he's very upset. There's diaries of his that still remain, and seems like there was a lot of both grief and guilt tied up in all of that.
Was she a frustrated lesbian and he felt bad about it?
Maybe. I didn't read that explicitly, but who knows? And he didn't write for a long time after that happened. That happened, I think, 58, I believe, 1858. And he didn't write for a long time. He was really upset, and it fucked him up for a while.
As losing a spouse should do if you liked them.
Yeah. He gets back into writing fiction a few years on, like in the 1860s, writes a couple of pretty famous short stories. There's one called Uncle Silas. I am, of course, blanking on the names of the other one, but there are multiple like famous short stories of his. And then he writes Carmilla in 1871, released in 72, and then he dies like a year later.
Oh, Carmilla got him.
Maybe. Or just, I don't know, healthcare in the 1870s. one or the other.
What do you mean? Everyone was so healthy.
So healthy.
Everything was going so well.
The doctors knew all kinds of things and then just feed you narcotics on narcotics on narcotics.
I was going to say, there's leeches, there's laudanum. There's leeches soaked in laudanum.
What more could you want? Honestly, I would take some laudanum right now if I'm being honest.
I wake up most days and could use a nice glass of laudanum, but you know, that's just struggling to get by in the capitalist hellscape for you.
You know, it's good stuff.
So where did the sex stuff come from? Like, what is he? So a thing that I am acutely aware of is that how do I put this? I believe in reparative reading, right? Mm-hmm. So I could read Carmilla and approach it in any number of ways.
Yeah.
As concerns, especially the very intense homoeroticism. Mm-hmm. I am guessing that Le Fanu is coming down on the side of the homoeroticism being troubling, not sexy.
So I've read a couple of different interpretations of that, and some were like, yeah, like it wasn't a good thing in there, but then some were like, in terms of the period of time, he actually was fairly copacetic with it. I've read both viewpoints of that. I had to skip over some of them in the synopsis because there's so many lines in which they're talking about Laura and Carmilla. It's very much discussed as they're both super turned on and also like really weirded out that they're turned on. So there's a lot of quotes like this this is in Laura's words, I experienced a strange, tumultuous excitement that was pleasurable, ever and anon, mingled with a vague sense of fear and disgust. I had no distinct thoughts about her while such scenes lasted, but I was conscious of a love growing into adoration and also of abhorrence. This I know is a paradox, but I can make no other attempt to explain this feeling.
Oh my God.
Yeah. So I don't read that as him being like, it was bad, just as these feelings are confusing.
I am continually shocked by how on the nose all of this is.
Yeah.
Like, the thing I can think of that is closest to it is reading the original cut of The Picture of Dorian Gray, where when you get a hold of the version that had all the stuff that he excised from it put back in, you're like, oh my God. You're just like, this is so gay.
Oh, yeah. I mean, well, and it makes sense for Oscar Wilde.
Yeah, no, I know, but like everyone is assigned the version, like the version everyone is assigned in high school has had a lot of stuff carved out of it. And so when you read that version, you're like, okay, this is pretty queer. But when you read the original, it's just so on the, like, there's no subtlety to it.
No.
And this, like that, I'm just like, how did you publish this? But I mean, I guess it's lesbians, so that's different. Is that part of the?
Yeah, I mean, it's always been more okay. For women, it's just like, no, it's just like feminine touch, and like women are just so pretty. How could you not want to just touch them? I think there's just always been like an undercurrent of that. And so there was a narrative ballad by Samuel Taylor Coleridge written around 1800 called Christabel that is a very similar plot line to this, and some people think that Carmilla is kind of an homage or adaptation of Christabel because it has a lot of the same themes, and that's 80 years prior to this, which I found really fascinating. Yeah, because that one came out in like around 1800. It was never fully finished. He had originally started writing it when he was publishing a book with Wordsworth, and they ended up not including it, and then a little bit later he published it alongside Kubla Khan in a pamphlet in like 1815.
Oh, wow.
So that's even earlier, and it's the same themes. This is just something that keeps recurring. Lord Byron also in around 1815, 1810, wrote a poem, and I'm sorry, I'm absolutely going to butcher this name. It's Giaour, but Giaour, I think, which is a Turkish word. So Byron spent some time on like a grand tour and spent some time in Turkey and like heard these mythological stories and everything and ended up writing a whole long poem about it. But there's themes of vampirism in it, and I'm just going to read a segment of the poem here. But first on earth is vampire sent, thy corse shall from its tomb be rent, then ghastly haunt thy native place, and suck the blood of all thy race. There from thy daughter, sister, wife, at midnight drain the stream of life, yet loathe the banquet which perforce must feed thy livid living course. Thy victims, ere they yet expire, shall know the demon for their sire. As cursing thee, thou cursing them, thy flowers are withered on thy stem. And that was another one from 1815.
Dang. Is that overtly a feminine?
No, but they only, for whatever reason, well, okay, so...
Because I think it said something about siring, so that's a male...
They are, but also like...
Or masculine, I should say.
That is a masculine terminology, but also that, and I don't know if that's a Byron thing specifically, but in any vampire media that you see in the last couple of decades, they tend to use that phrasing regardless of if they're talking about male or female. To sire another vampire can be a woman or can be a man. Drusilla, siring angel, if we're going to bring it back to Buffy. Like,
it always comes back to Buffy.
Comes back to Buffy. And I mean, that quote I just read about like the pleasurable and I was thinking about Buffy the whole freaking time I was reading this book. I was like, oh, that's Buffy in her relationships with both Angel and Spike. It is. And you're laughing at me right now. The shit was formative for me. Okay. It's a great show.
I bring you on to my literature podcast.
I'm sorry. I'm sorry. There are bound to be some listeners. We talked about The Simpsons in the last one.
I mean, it's true. Look, formative fiction is formative fiction. I'm not here to hate. Not really. But so like lesbian vampires.
Lesbian vampires. This one doesn't specifically, and I haven't read the entire thing. It's a lot longer than that. It's a whole thing. But the term giaour. It's an offensive Turkish word for infidel or non-believer. But this is kind of a custom that he was made aware of when he was on this grand tour, became aware of the Turkish custom of throwing a woman found guilty of adultery into the sea wrapped in a sack.
Oh.
So that was part of the impetus for him writing this poem, was hearing that story. And that's where the name came from. And then it talks about, preying on daughter, sister, wife. It's not specific queer or lesbian, but it's very much hearing the story about women being not infidel. Oh my God. Women doing infidelity, women being
Adulterous?
adulterous. Why could I not get that word? He's hearing this myth about what happens to adulterous women. And, stories of vampirism have been around for literally centuries. It's in so many different cultures. There's so many different variations on this. But the fact that it was specifically like reading about adulterous women and sucking the blood of your daughter, your sister, your wife, my bloodline, my kin, all these women. So there's no lesbian specifically in that, but there's definitely tie-ins to like the female aspect of it. And then that's getting into the kind of like incestuous, like you're staying within your bloodline, like you're going after your daughter, your sister, your wife, which Laura is Carmilla Malarca's descendant.
Right.
Like,
yeah. There's the incest bit.
Yeah. They are of the same bloodline.
Which, again, as a critique of the aristocracy, that makes so much sense because, look, they already knew inbreeding was bad.
We've already talked about the Habsburg chin here.
They already knew it was a problem.
Yeah.
And
still happened all the time, but
it's interesting to think about at least one aspect of it as being kind of a critique of these rich landed gentry who are preoccupied with their sort of incestuous interfamilial power struggles, while the countryside around them just has to cope with the aftermath.
Yep.
And that's really...
like, our children are dying and you're too busy fucking each other.
Well, right. And I mean, that also makes the little afterword you explained make more sense about how Carmilla wasn't able to be stopped for so long because the man was, besotted with her and intentionally hid her grave. And again, like that is aristocratic intrigue resulting in bloodshed for everyone.
Yes. For 2 centuries.
So are Carmilla and Laura both kind of the problem here then?
I mean, Carmilla's definitely a problem, but she was foisted on everyone by a man who couldn't get over his emotions.
I mean, sure, but Laura's
being oblivious because she's horny.
Well, and Laura's part and parcel of the same family, right?
She's,
I guess from one perspective, is she like a kind of easily corruptible byproduct of the same fucked up family?
I would say yes. Raised in somewhat lonely, but with a doting father. There's a line she has in here somewhere about basically being like super spoiled and like her father gave her everything because she was his only family and her mom died young. So she's super doted on, lives in this manor house with 2 governesses who kind of just do everything that she ever needs.
2 governesses and no friends.
And
poor little rich girl.
Yeah, I mean, truly she is. And it's like with that whole opening sequence of the dream she had when she was 6 and talking about like, I wasn't afraid of shit. I was taken care of. I had people to watch over me. That's the first time I've ever been scared in my life. And it's like, wow, must be nice, first of all.
Right? So then is this her awakening to the world at large? Is this her developing a consciousness of the things that happen outside of the walls of her, pretty but isolated manor?
I mean, yeah, that would make a lot of sense. And like I said, it's not like they were completely isolated. They had people that would pass through. They would go into town or like go visit places or whatever. But for the most part, she lived there pretty isolated with her peeps. Both her governesses were not from the area. I think one was French and the other one was like German or something, or maybe Austrian as well. But they both were like not from specifically right there. So she had some kind of influence from the outside world, but they still never left their little enclave. Granted, gorgeous Gothic castle in the middle of these like picturesque woods with moats and drawbridges and blah, 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 blah. So it's like she's doing all right for herself.
Yeah, I mean, sounds nice.
I mean, my sympathy only goes so far there. But yeah, she's being introduced to things she's never felt before. And she's hearing about these balls and masquerades, and like Carmilla's a mystery to her. It's this total stranger that's come in and just been dropped literally into her lap, and she's like, oh, I'm feeling things. What is this happening to me? Yeah, that could absolutely be both like, yes, queerness, but also, hey, there's a world outside of the little bubble that you live in.
It's funny how often the discovery of sex and the discovery of consequences go hand in hand.
Yeah. It's a real bummer.
Whoops.
Yeah, so in one of these articles that I was reading, it's called, well, we'll put this in the show notes, but this particular one was titled Unnameable Desires in Le Fanu's Carmilla. Le Fanu uses the figure of the vampire to express the frightening specter of homosexuality, a creature feeding on its own gender and family. And then they quote another article in here. A monster's body is a cultural body that incarnates a culture's worst fears, fantasies, and taboos. So they're talking about their relationship as a monstrosity in terms that would equally express Victorian fears of same-sex relations. Which I love that a monster's body is a cultural body in terms of just like the literary representation of monsters.
Yeah, no, I love that. And a thing that is so interesting to me about literature in a general sense, and especially stuff like this, is that the things that you are supposed to take for granted as upsetting can change so much, that those scenes that you were reading me where Laura is being, preyed upon, but sexily preyed upon, the reader is supposed to automatically and intuitively find distasteful.
Yes.
And contemporary, and I just don't, you know what I mean? Like, because you could take about half of that and copy and paste it into any number of romance novels I reviewed over the years, and it would be, it would pass. It'd be great.
Yeah, that's... I mean, think about, I don't just bring it to something that was like really big culturally, but there's probably very similar lines in 50 Shades of Grey.
Oh, I mean, the writing in 50 Shades of Grey is much, much worse.
Oh, I mean, it's trash, but like just in terms of, no, this is supposed to be disgusting, but like, oh, I'm so like, oh, it's so bad. It's so horny. Like,
yeah. The audience is supposed to intuit that this desire is disturbing on its face.
Yeah.
And when you remove that cultural assumption, the whole book changes.
Truly, it does. And I mean, I think this book was, it was well known when it came out. He was an established author. He had very popular short stories, was working in literary magazines and everything. Like, he had a following.
Yeah, I was going to ask what the cultural reception was.
Yeah, I mean, he was super popular, and it was a popular story. I don't know. I didn't read anything about it being like, oh, this is so terrible. It was more just like people were fascinated in the story. And I guarantee you there were a lot of women who read it that were like, yeah. Yeah, no, that's terrible. It's so bad. Like,
honey, I'm going to bed. I need to reread Carmilla to remind myself how frightening it is when women desire other women.
Yeah, no, it's like really terrible.
I need to go have a lie down.
Yeah. I didn't read anything specific that was like, oh, people were so weirded out by it or anything, but there's a reason that this book is having a resurgence and people are super into it. There were a lot of passages in here that reminded me of another book that is in no way subtle about this kind of things, which is the Claudine novels by Colette. Have you read those?
I haven't, actually. It's on the list.
I find that surprising, actually. I've read them all multiple times.
Well, you're gonna have to come back and tell me about them.
They're gay as fuck. Like,
love that.
It is. And honestly, less subtle than this.
Well, those are from the 20s? Embarrassingly, I've seen the Keira Knightley movie about her.
I don't think I even realized.
Yeah, 1920 was one of her first novels. So
okay, so about 50-year difference there. So yeah, I mean, that's, she's out and out having relationships with women in those books. She's bisexual as hell.
Yeah.
Like, she is definitely bi, and I think like Colette was too, for sure.
Yeah. We do a very good job forgetting how queer the past is, generation to generation. Like, we go through these little miniature dark ages, and I use dark ages in the correct term, which is to mean a lack of resources, where we successfully scrub things for brief periods of time.
Yeah.
And then pretend they never existed. And then they kind of get rediscovered, and then they get scrubbed, and then they get rediscovered. And right now, heartbreakingly, we're in a scrubbing period.
Yeah, which is awful on a lot of levels. people are like, no one was out in those days because it was illegal. And I was like, no, like,
yeah, they were.
They were out as hell, and people were having like relationships, and like trans people were out in the world and living their life. People kind of just knew, and it was just like, oh yeah, like so and so. That's just how they live their life.
Queerness has always been here.
Literally always. Gay people have always existed. Trans people have always existed. It's not a new phenomenon. It's just a little bit more out in the open and slightly less taboo now. We also haven't come nearly as far as we think we have in a lot of these respects, which is fucked up.
Well, and that's why I was asking about sort of the authorial intent.
Yeah.
What do we know about what Le Fanu was thinking? What were his goals?
Well, and that's so I've read from multiple like literary theory ideas. I've read people both saying in analyses that he was saying it was bad. And then I've also read people saying that, no, he was pretty like ambiguous and was just like kind of presenting it as, yeah, there are some things in there where like, oh, it's terrible, but like I'm turned on and it's terrible. And that also just could have been a reflection of what it was like in the time. And he wasn't necessarily saying that it's a bad thing. I've read multiple people saying both of those things. So I'm not really sure, to be honest.
Well, that's great, honestly.
Yeah.
I can roll with not really sure.
Yeah, I'd like to think that he was just presenting it as the way certain people live. I don't know.
We stand an ambiguous king. I mean,
yeah.
And there, there's obviously layers happening here.
Well, and I will say, like, the fact that he grew up deeply in the church in the 1800s, who knows?
Well,
but
I mean,
he also
Calvinism is rough.
Yeah,
Calvinism is a rough worldview. Like,
yeah, and it doesn't say. I mean, I'm sure his childhood was weird, and I'm sure being raised by an almost Calvinist, stern clergyman was a stressful time. But he wasn't a devout Christian. It sounds like he kind of like went to church throughout his life and everything, and his wife at one point had a crisis of faith and everything, but he wasn't out there spouting theology at people and trying to shove it down people's throats and all that kind of thing.
Yeah, actually, now that you mention it, there is a startling lack of priests in this book.
There are a few that show up.
Yeah, but they're not, correct me if I'm wrong, but it sounded from your synopsis like they're not any of the really main players.
No, not even a little bit. They're none of them are named. They're just these figures that show up on occasion when she's sick, or like when in that original nightmare she had when she's 6 and she freaks out. They have a priest come. They make a few appearances throughout the time when there's weird happening, but again, they're never named characters.
Do they do anything useful?
No, of course not. No.
That's really interesting.
Yeah, it is, especially knowing his background.
Yeah.
Yeah. They're kind of just there to be like, hello, God's presence is here. But everything keeps happening. It doesn't stop anything. Things progressively get worse. The priests don't help at all. They do make one reference in there to the hunchback wanderer that shows up with all his little trinkets. Like he's convinced he has all of these trinkets and charms that can help keep vampires away. And there's kind of a one-off line in there about how okay, so this is actually, I was thinking it was in the actual text of the book, but this is in one of Machado's footnotes, which are, some of them are referencing very specific historic things or giving like geographical context, and some of them are clearly conjecture that she put in, which I love. They're all a lot of fun. So they're talking about the wanderer that comes in and selling them these charms, and she makes a footnote. When he was a young man, the Mountebank had a dream that one day he would encounter a vampire. He set about acquiring as much knowledge as possible about these beings, including charms, trinkets, and spells that would keep them at bay. He did earnestly believe them to work, but only because of a coincidence. He stayed safe because of a crucifix stitched into his tunic by a seamstress who had taken a liking to him and was concerned for his safety. The fact that he did not recognize the vampire when he saw her would be an acute embarrassment that would haunt him for the rest of his days. He later married the seamstress and apologized to his dog. There's a line in there about him yelling at his dog. I had forgotten that was not actually in the text of the book, was just a footnote by her, but I love that so much.
A of all, that is so delightful.
So good.
B of all, what a phenomenal way to footnote a text.
There are, so...
Can I see?
Yeah. I have a few other earmarked in there that I'll show you, like getting into like the mythology of the story and just kind of adding to it. And it's so good. And I didn't even get into her introduction, which I thought some of it was real. And then I did a little research. I was like, oh, she is straight making shit up, and it's amazing. It's so
love
good.
This. That is delightful, and I am now going to go buy a copy of this edition. I mean, I was already probably going to, but now I definitely am.
Yeah, and I mean, you can obviously borrow my copy, although it's like deeply noted up now, but you should probably get your own.
I'm going to buy another one so that Carmen Maria Machado gets hopefully more royalties.
Yeah, that's fair. I respect that. She deserves it. Yeah, she has so many good footnotes. Like I said, there was so many additions that she made to the text. Okay, well, here's another one that's kind of relevant to the themes of like homosexuality and everything that we've been getting into. So if you remember from the last episode and the synopsis, when the general is describing how he meets Malarca, the vampire,
with her very clever I cannot get over the anagram thing. I'm so sorry. Carry on.
Well, and we will get more into that. He's talking about the dramatic woman draped in black velvet. She referred to many times she had met me at court and at distinguished houses. She alluded to little incidents I had long forgotten, but which I found had only lain dormant in my memory, for they instantly started into life at her touch. I became more and more curious to ascertain who she was every moment. She parried my attempts to discover very adroitly and pleasantly. The knowledge she showed of many passages in my life seemed to me all but unaccountable, and she appeared to take pleasure in foiling my curiosity and seeing me flounder in my eager perplexity from one conjecture to another. And then the footnote from Machado is, though he does not say so here, the mysterious woman in fact laid bare one of the general's greatest and most hidden secrets, his lover, Kurt, whom he had served with decades before. Not only did she know of Kurt's existence and all the dimensions of their relationship, she knew the words Kurt had said to him in parting, which he had softly dropped into the shell of his ear. I already miss our season.
That's delightful.
It is. And I mean, she gets into the mythology of the area and ghost stories. Very fun, fascinating additions to this. And I mean, we both already love her writing. They blend in so well that I kind of forgot at certain points that this is just her doing her addendums to it. Like there were a few of them that I was like, oh yeah, that makes sense. And I was like, wait a second. Wait a second.
That's so cool though. Like
it's really, really cool.
What a great concept.
Yeah. Also, side note, there's some really amazing illustrations in this book. And listeners, if you pick up this copy, you should just flip through because there's some very cool drawings.
Yeah.
Throughout.
While you were reading quotes, I was admiring them from across the studio, as it were. But one of the last quotes that you read suddenly reminded me that I had been wanting to ask you about Vampire Mommy. What?
Yeah.
What the hell?
Yeah. That was something I want. Okay. Thank you for saying that because that was something I wanted to bring up and I had forgotten. Nothing. We got nothing.
Oh.
Everything I mentioned about her, that was all that was said about her in the freaking book. And I'm like, Sheridan, tell me more. You can't just drop this fascinating, cryptic woman into here. And then we have.
That means they're still out there.
Yeah. She's still out there.
That means Mommy Vampire Queen is still running around.
Where is the sequel?
Didn't he die?
Yeah, he died like a year after. There's no sequel.
I'm sorry. It's very funny to say, where's the sequel when he died? Vampire Mommy got him. He got too close.
And so she is, to the strangers that she's foisting this, her ward daughter, whatever on, she refers to Carmilla as her daughter, but like, is that her daughter? So that is something you'll see between them too, is the occasional knowing glance. She's foisting Carmilla or Malarca or Marcilla, whatever, onto. It's always a hapless man with a beautiful young daughter, and she's enchanting the man and sending her daughter to go enchant the daughter.
So A of all, she's clearly taking revenge for something. B of all, she's obviously the being that turned Carmilla into a vampire. She's obviously her vampire mommy.
That would be my assumption. Yeah, I am glad you brought that up because that was absolutely something that I wanted to get into and I had forgotten about. It left me with so many questions and I was like, why didn't you give me more details? And also she sounds like a badass and I'm curious and I want to know more about her. Please describe her dress in more detail and what she was wearing at the masquerade ball.
I mean, objectively, I want to be very clear because I see this happen a lot and I am on a one-woman crusade to slightly adjust how we as a culture interact with literature. She was in there just enough to serve her purpose.
She was, yes, I agree.
And to be left with compelling questions about a story after a story is over is not actually a bad thing.
It is not, and I know that. I do know that.
Okay, Mom.
It's like, yeah, I feel like a good writer leaves you wanting more.
Yeah, 100%.
Like, it got tied up nicely. There was like a little conclusion. They tied up that whole story and everything, but it left you with these, like, what about that?
Well, and what's really compelling about it is it means the problem is not solved.
Yeah.
They think the problem is solved.
Yeah.
But she's still out there, presumably capable of making more vampires.
Well, and in the prologue from Le Fanu, upon a paper attached to the following narrative, Dr. Celius has written a rather elaborate note. Basically, it's just like, I received this fascinating story that I am just presenting to you. The narrative has been written by Laura as a letter or whatever to Dr. Celius. And the last paragraph of the really short prologue is, I was anxious upon discovering this paper to reopen the correspondence commenced by Dr. Hesselius so many years before with a person so clever and careful as his informant seems to have been. Much to my regret, however, I found that she had died in the interval. And then this last line annoys me. Oh, he's like, that being said, she probably could have added little to the narrative which she communicates with such fastidious detail in the following pages. Like, bruh. After all of that, you said she could have added little to the conversation. I know she went into detail, but it's a little dismissive.
Clearly, she's useless because of her womb.
But I like to imagine that her dying in the interval is Mama Vampire came and got her.
You're like, what happened?
You know, she thought she was safe.
Vengeance.
Yeah, she's a fascinating, briefly visited character that I was just very fascinated by her, and both of the men's infatuation with her and the abrupt way with which she just abandoned Carmilla with both of them. Here, take my child. Bye-bye. I have an urgent matter to attend to.
Bye.
And they're like, oh, okay. Like,
it's truly delightful. I'm happy for her. I hope she's slaughtering men somewhere.
you know, just out there living her best life.
Eating people.
What more could you want?
Really?
She's got all the riches.
She's rich. She looks great. She's dressed well. She's eating men.
Yep.
The dream.
I mean, okay, so with her appearance in that masquerade ball, the stories don't really necessarily have anything in common, but it immediately had me thinking about like the Count of Monte Cristo. Very superficially, like he was describing this like insane masquerade ball and this insane party that they were throwing. Then this like curious, mysterious woman shows up and is captivating people and they don't really know who she is. She's got this mask on. Everyone's like, who is she? Like blah, 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 blah. It just very much reminded me of that scene in The Count of Monte Cristo in the book, which was way better than the movie.
Hard agree.
Ugh. I saw the movie first and I was like, oh, this is tight. And then I read the book and I was like, that was trash. It was so dumb. I hated it. Although Jim Caviezel, who I think is the lead, was very hot in it, so that was cool. He throws that massive party after he's getting his revenge on everyone. No one knows who he is yet, and he's this like curious and enigmatic figure. He's having this masquerade ball, and like that was the exact same vibe that I got from Mama Vampire when the general first meets her.
This is clearly a thing that we all in our heart of hearts aspire to.
Yeah.
Just like way deep down, we're like, I'm going to throw the most incredible party and everyone's going to want to know who I am. And I'm going to be so mysterious.
Yeah.
No, but I mean, that's outside of our deep, dark middle school fantasies. I feel like there is a literary tradition of parties like that being magnets for comeuppance. And because it happens a lot, right? I'm thinking of, is it The Mask of the Red Death? The Poe story where basically the plague shows up.
You know, I have read numerous Poe stories. I have not read that one. I do think about the Cask of Amontillado all the time because I have a bottle of Amontillado sherry in my cooler, and every time I see it, I think about bodies in that drink.
It's in The Mask of the Red Death.
The Great Gatsby.
The Great Gatsby.
Has an element of that.
I mean, the Cask of Amontillado kicks off at a party, doesn't it?
I believe it does, actually, yeah.
Going back to Poe, I feel like there is a sense, there has long been a sense that the wealthy and the aristocratic class, by virtue of allowing themselves to be so egregiously ostentatious, are inviting the hands of fate.
Yes.
We love that image, and we return to it in fiction again and again and again.
Yeah. Absolutely. And that's why stories like, I don't know, like Patty Hearst just absolutely grabbed the attention. Just like, I don't know why that's the first thing that came to my mind.
That is such a bonkers story.
No, it's insane. I think just pops into my head every once in a while.
You're Wrong About did a really good episode about Patty Hearst. Highly recommend.
I thought you were about to tell me I was wrong about Patty
Hearst. Oh, no.
I was like, I'm pretty sure she did some crazy shit.
That's the name of the podcast.
I know. It's
really good.
A second.
I love them.
Yeah, no, I know that one, but yeah, there is a very much and yeah, getting your comeuppance, and that goes back to the themes of with him being an Irish writer.
I don't know what you're talking about. Everything was famously chill in Ireland from the 15 to the 1900s. Nothing went wrong.
Yeah, no, it was
a great time.
Super cool.
Yeah, just the best. Nothing bad happened. They didn't lose like an astonishing percentage of their population.
No.
I mean, look,
it was fun.
I have family in England and I love them dearly, but if there's one thing the British Empire loved, it was trying to starve mass numbers of people to death in countries that they thought they owned.
Yeah. Colonialism.
Hashtag just girl things. Anyway, was there anything else you really wanted to
So just a brief talk, because we talked about like the anagram of her name and everything. So I was reading a little bit about the just kind of,
I just can't stop imagining her being like, they'll never figure this out.
Yeah, so in one of these papers I was reading, it's talking about all of the different plays on her name and all of the different meanings. So yeah, it was well, I keep saying M-I-L, like Mallorca, which would be like the kind of Spanish pronunciation, but this takes place in Austria and everything, so I'm assuming it's Mallorca. I don't actually know. We'll say Mallorca. Mallorca also seems to pun on the words both Arcadia and Arcanum, a play on the idea of ancient pastoral pleasure and ancient mysteries.
Ooh.
Whose secret has been hidden in the depths of time, which is fascinating with her living in that tomb. So ancient pleasures, all that is very, very cool to me. And then there's some talk in here about Dr. Hesselius being the precursor to Dracula's Van Helsing. Purely conjecture, but it's interesting to think about. And when I was reading the descriptions, of that popped into my head as well. And he's also just such a cultural touchstone when you're talking about vampire media. And again, we both are avid watchers of What We Do in the Shadows. Like, spoiler alert, Guillermo is a descendant of the Van Helsings. I loved that storyline so freaking much. It was so good. But that's Mallorca. And then for Mircalla, which is her first incarnation. So Kala has a meaning of like the beautiful, and then Mira for miracle. She is indeed miraculous in her ability to slip through locked doors and sealed rooms. Her beauty is universally admired. They're all very like blunt in your face anagrams, but when you look at this breakdown of all of the different meanings of what these names could be, it's very fascinating. There's a line somewhere in the book where Laura wonders if her guest could possibly be a male lover in disguise. Was there here a disguise in a romance, she wonders.
Oh.
If a boyish, I didn't even get into that because there was so much other stuff. She's like,
get into it now.
What if a boyish lover had found his way into the house and sought to prosecute his suit and masquerade? And again, this was a one-off line that they never get into again.
Whoa.
Yeah. That's a whole other freaking conversation right there. And then there's a line in here, like homosexuality itself, famously described by Oscar Wilde's lover as a love that dare not speak its name. There's just a lot more subtext there, like based on the names, not just, oh, haha, funny anagrams.
All right, credit where it's due. I was trying to have a childish giggle, but I guess this author actually thought about what he was doing and had a reason for it.
Yeah, this Unnameable Desires article or journal entry, whatever, was really cool.
Yeah.
And a lot of the research I got was from in here, which we can post in the...
Who wrote it?
A woman named Amy Leal from Syracuse University.
All right, Amy.
Yeah. Good job, Amy. Thank you for your help in this podcast. I very much appreciate it. It's a really fascinating article that gets a lot more in depth.
Shout out, Amy. If you're still in academia, I hope you're being paid something resembling a living wage.
The storyline itself it doesn't feel that deep necessarily when you're reading it. She was a vampire and we're just going to throw all this stuff in your face. And again, like you said during the book, this is kind of the start of a lot of these tropes. So it feels like you're being bashed over the head with it. But at the time, this wouldn't have.
Yeah, it was all novel. It was new.
Now we read it, it's just like, well, yeah, of course she doesn't come down until the afternoon and not eating breakfast or praying with them or anything. But
it is funny how the works that change everything that comes after them wind up getting retroactively discounted for quote unquote like adhering too closely to the thing that they created.
Yeah. And again, he's not creating the myth of the vampire that is, and as we've said before, is something that's been around for like millennia. This is a long standing idea of vampires or revenants existing. And again, I talked about that like Byron poem and everything. And again, of all the vampire media that I've consumed in my lifetime, you can see just so many parallels from like the shit that Le Fanu is writing in here and like just like compiling all together. And so many people are like, Dracula was the big work. And it's like, no, like you can clearly see the influence that came from this book. And
you're like, shut up, Bram. Carmilla is where it's at. So, and I realized that you already told me that you grabbed this off the shelf because you saw Carmen Maria Machado's name, which is a fantastic reason to grab anything off of any shelf at any time.
Yeah.
But what about Carmilla like spoke to you? What made it worth not just reading after you bought it, but bringing it here, talking about it into a microphone for a couple of hours?
Well, I tend to like horror, and like the horror.
Goddamn Rhode Islanders.
You know, I just gotta throw it out there every once in a while. I worked hard to be able to pronounce that word right, and it still doesn't always come out right.
The horror.
The horror. Yeah, I mean, I tend to like this style of writing already. I tend to like Victorian Gothic stuff in a general sense. I've always been fascinated by vampire stories, and it's a historic novel that I've always wanted to read, and I do think it's interesting. So I don't know. I wasn't isolated as a child. Like I had friends and everything, but I was like kind of a loner, and I was very much the type to just like sit in a tree for hours by myself reading and imagining like wild scenarios.
This doesn't resonate with me at all.
No, it's definitely not like one of the reasons we became good friends.
No.
We didn't connect over all kinds of shit like that right off the bat. Yeah, and I don't know, it just grabbed me in very quickly. And again, also like I've always been super into, like, again, as we talked about in the Nathaniel Hawthorne episode, I've always been very interested in like Gothic architecture. I immediately fell into, I had a very good mental image 2 pages into this of the exact aesthetic of what this was like, the life that they were leading. It just grabbed me right away. It was very fun. When I am reading a book, I want to have a vivid mental picture right away of what things are looking like, if that makes sense. Yeah. Which, when you were describing Rappaccini's daughter, that came through. It connected to me with a lot of the media I have consumed over my life. I drew a lot of parallels right off the bat to a bunch of things I have already read and loved and watched and all of that.
You're a sensory details bitch.
Truly, I really am. I didn't think about it that way, but yes, I'm all about the sensory details. And
those are
did
important.
A really good job with it. Also, I like horny things. I'm frequently horny. This book was frequently horny.
I was about to say, like, what speaks to you about like vampire narratives in general, but you already answered.
Sex. It's the sex.
You already answered my question.
It's the sex, but it's also like the melancholy,
sad sex.
You know? I mean, I've had sad sex before, and you know what? It was still good.
I've never thought about the fact that vampire novels are just for those of us who like our sex to be a little bit of a bummer.
They're all like,
we want the sex to be good, but sad.
Most vampire stories, they're kind of melancholy beings that are also always seeking pleasure in some kind. And as we've joked about many times, Grace is giving me such a look right now. As we've talked about many times, like, I'm kind of a hedonist, but I'm also full of emotions. And like, yes, like I am frequently in the moment, like, what is going to make me feel the best in this particular moment? And you know what? That's not always good for you. And it doesn't always work out for the vampires either.
I'm a hedonist with existential dread.
I mean, yes. You know me very well. Is that not an apt description?
And that is why I like novels like Carmilla, which says to me that Carmen Maria Machado is also a hedonist with existential dread. Nobody tell me if I'm wrong. I'm happier this way. Well,
yeah.
So this is my last question for you. Where do you think you see this narrative or aspects of this narrative or products of this narrative like still in play contemporarily? Like, have you read any contemporary fiction that really reminds you of this, or other than Buffy? You bitch.
No, I mean, I can't think of anything off the top of my head like really comes to mind, just because, again, like as we've talked about before, I was an avid reader as a child, but haven't been as into it lately. It's just hard to find the time and the concentration, what with all the living out my hedonistic lifestyle. It's just so hard to find time for books.
The hedonism does eat into the reading time, depending. Not if you do it right, though. You can be a hedonist and still read.
That's true. I loved the Claudine novels when I was younger. I read those avidly in high school. I still have my copy somewhere with the cover torn off of it. Like, so many parallels in there. There was so much that came up in there that reminded me of that, and I loved those books when I was younger.
It continues to astonish me that you think you're straight.
I mean, we're all a little bit bisexual.
I'll probably cut that.
I mean, it was like one of my favorite books, and it's so queer.
Madam.
I know. And so that is like the strongest parallel that I'm thinking of outside of Buffy.
I mean, there's Anne Rice, right?
Oh,
who,
God. I can't believe we haven't even talked about Anne Rice. I've been fucking up.
The goddess of queer vampires.
I read all of those books, too.
One of my, very quick aside, one of my favorite things about Anne Rice is when I was still reviewing romance novels, after 50 Shades of Grey came out. I don't know if you're aware, but Anne Rice had a series of books called The Sleeping Beauty.
Yes, you told me about this
trilogy.
At the time, and I still haven't read them, and I really need to.
So they are super intense, like heavy sections of like non-con, like BDSM.
Because wasn't she like
novel, like romance novels?
Like 50 Shades came out, and she was like, oh, bet.
So she wrote them very early in her career when her first books didn't perform the way that she wanted. And she was like, fuck it, I'll write a romance novel. And she published them under a pseudonym. Yeah. And then eventually people figured it out. She was never a huge fan of that. She felt a little embarrassed. Not embarrassed, but like she didn't love them as part of her legacy.
Right.
However, many years later, when 50 Shades of Grey came out, she was like, that's not how you write a romance. That's not how you write a BDSM romance. This is how you write a BDSM romance. And she wrote a whole new one. She added to the series all of those years later and published it fresh, basically to be like, you have no idea what you're doing. This is how to do what you think you're doing.
Can I ask a quick question?
And I reviewed it.
Quick question. Why is your Anne Rice voice Crocodile Dundee?
That's not a knife. This is a knife. Anyway, so like obviously Anne Rice, like this is clearly an influence on Anne Rice.
Oh, 100%. And again, I'm deeply disappointed in myself for not having talked about Anne Rice earlier in all of this because, yeah, 100%.
I haven't read any of her work in quite a while. I'm assuming it ages okay.
Yeah, God, I haven't read those books since probably high school at this point in time, which is farther away than I like to think about.
Well, shit.
Well, fuck.
Hails Bales!
Oh, my stars and bars.
This has been lovely, Galen.
This has been lovely.
Thank you so much for bringing me this book.
Thank you so much for having me. This was honestly like a very good motivation for me to actually like get off my ass and finish a fucking book because I really do miss reading a lot. And I, as you well know, sometimes I need structure to get things done. So that was really good.
It's almost like we both have ADHD.
Yeah. Crazy.
Sometimes you need a little external structure.
Yeah. Deadlines are good. They're very helpful sometimes. And this was fun. And I honestly was like, oh God, I have to do research. But I was getting in there and reading stuff. And I was like, I kind of miss doing this sometimes. There's so many cool things out there. I started reading more and I was like, oh no, there's so much more out there.
The secret to research is that it always leads to more research.
I forgot that. It's been so long since I had to do it. I graduated college 13 years ago and I haven't written a paper since then.
But it's also secretly kind of fun.
It is. I already fall into rabbit holes all the time. It's nice to have somewhat of a structure for your rabbit hole. So
right. Well, thank you so much for being here with me today.
Yes.
And thank you to everyone listening for being here with us. Galen and I are going to go get a drink.
Yep.
And I am thankful for all of you, your time, your attention. We are excited to be with you. We'll be back with you next week. And as always, if you can, this week, this month, this pay period, consider supporting a living author because they could really use the love.
Yep.
Love you. Bye.
Bye.
Didn't Read It was created, written, and edited by me, Grace Todd. Kaylee Hughes is our publicist and producer. You can follow the podcast on Twitter or Instagram at Didn't Read It Pod, or reach us via email at didn'treaditpod@gmail.com. For source notes and further reading, as well as a list of all existing episodes, please visit our website at didn'treaditpod.com. We are recorded in Richmond, Virginia, with special thanks to Black Iris Social Club and Pesca Trio Publishing. If you enjoyed today's episode, please consider leaving us a review or rating on your preferred podcasting platform, or just tell a friend. If you did not enjoy today's episode, we are currently accepting applications for a full-time nemesis. Our intro music is Books, written, performed, and recorded by William Albritton.
Our closing music for this episode is The Witch Lair by Adam Saban, because it's spooky.